The judge's voice didn't rise, didn't accuse, didn't even sound surprised. It was calm, practiced, almost kind. "Ma'am, did you authorize these changes to your will?" For a moment the courtroom faded. I could hear my own breathing, slow and steady, and I remember thinking how strange it was that after a lifetime of raising children, building a home and surviving grief, everything now rested on a single question asked by a stranger in a black robe. I am 72 years old, born and raised in Texas, and I have always believed that preparation was a form of love. When my husband and I married nearly 50 years ago, we had little more than determination and a second-hand dining table. He worked construction, I kept books at a small firm during the day and balanced our household accounts at night. When the children were small, I learned to stretch a dollar until it nearly cried. When they grew older, I taught them that honesty mattered, that papers mattered, that your word should match your signature. When my husband died suddenly 21 years ago, people expected me to unravel. Instead, I reorganized. Grief has a way of clarifying what truly needs attention. I paid off the mortgage, invested cautiously, and met with an attorney every few years to review my estate. I wanted things clear, simple, fair. My children would be provided for equally and transparently. I told them this many times. I believed clarity would prevent conflict. My eldest son, Mark, stepped naturally into the role of advisor. He spoke confidently, dressed well, and liked to explain things to me even when I hadn't asked. My daughter Elaine lived closest. She drove me to appointments, brought groceries, and helped with errands. She had a gentle voice that people trusted easily. My youngest, David, lived out of state and called less often, but when he did, he sounded fond if distant. On the surface, I appeared fortunate. Friends would tell me how lucky I was to have such attentive children. I agreed because I wanted it to be true. The first changes were subtle enough to dismiss. My mail sometimes arrived already opened, envelopes slid a little too neatly. When I mentioned it, Elaine smiled and said I must have forgotten opening them myself. I laughed along, uneasy but unwilling to seem suspicious. At the bank, a teller once told me my son had already handled a question I was asking about my account. I felt a flicker of irritation, quickly replaced by reassurance. After all, Mark was good with numbers. He always had been. Then there were the comments. "You don't need to worry about this anymore, Mom. Let us take care of it. You've earned your rest." They sounded kind, even loving, but they carried an undertone that unsettled me. Decisions were being made around me, not with me. When I pushed back, I was told I was being stubborn. When I insisted on understanding, I was told I was tired. The moment that truly lodged in my chest came during a routine doctor's visit. The nurse handed me a clipboard with notes already written, including a line about possible memory decline. I hadn't spoken yet. When I asked the doctor about it privately, he hesitated before admitting my daughter had called ahead, concerned about my mental state. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel, realizing that a version of me was being quietly introduced to the world without my consent. That night, I opened the small safe I kept hidden behind winter coats. Inside were copies of my will, trust documents, and powers of attorney, papers I reviewed regularly, papers that made me feel secure. The folder felt thinner in my hands. Several pages were missing. My heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed, as if my body understood before my mind did. Something was wrong, and it was no longer theoretical. I called Mark the next morning. I asked him directly if any changes had been made to my estate. There was a pause long enough to tell me everything. When he finally spoke, his tone was patient, almost indulgent. He said they were only doing what was best, that I wasn't as sharp as I used to be, that I should trust them. I thanked him for his honesty and hung up the phone. My hands were steady. My voice had not shaken. That was the moment I stopped assuming goodwill and started paying attention to evidence. I did not confront Elaine. I did not alert anyone else. I took out a notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. Trust the paper, not the people. I understood then that love, when mixed with entitlement, could become something dangerous. I also understood that if my children believed I was incapable, they had underestimated the very woman who had built everything they stood to inherit. I had spent decades preparing for the future. I was not about to let it be rewritten without my knowledge. Quietly, deliberately, I began to take my life back, one document at a time. The weeks that followed felt strangely divided, as though I were living two lives at once. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Elaine still called to remind me of appointments I already remembered. Mark still sent brief messages about handling things on my behalf. Friends still assumed I was being well cared for. Beneath that calm, however, I was watching more closely than I ever had before, listening not just to what was said but to what was avoided. The first clear incident came with my bank statements. One afternoon I noticed a withdrawal that made no sense, too large, too specific. When I asked Elaine about it over tea, she barely looked up from her phone. She said Mark had moved some funds temporarily, that it was easier this way, that I shouldn't worry myself. The way she said it, lightly and without detail, made my stomach tighten. I went to the bank alone the next morning and asked for a printout of recent transactions. The teller hesitated before explaining that my son had been added as an authorized signer weeks earlier. I hadn't authorized anything. I walked out of the building feeling smaller than I had in years, not because I was weak, but because someone had decided I was. The second incident cut deeper because it was public. At a family gathering for my grandson's birthday, Mark joked loudly about how I was always misplacing things now. Elaine chimed in, smiling, telling everyone how she'd taken over my paperwork before it became a problem. Laughter rippled around the table. I smiled too, though my face felt stiff, as if it belonged to someone else. Inside, a quiet humiliation settled. They were rehearsing a narrative, and they were comfortable doing it in front of witnesses. I went home early that night and sat alone in the dark living room, listening to the old clock tick. I thought about how often women my age are described as fading, fragile, forgetful. I realized how easy it would be for others to believe that story, especially when it came from my own children. The betrayal wasn't just about money or documents. It was about erasing my authority while I was still alive to feel it. The third incident was the one that finally stripped away any remaining doubt. A letter arrived from a legal office I didn't recognize, addressed to my daughter as my representative. It referenced amendments to my will that I had never seen. My hands trembled as I read it, not from confusion but from clarity. This was no longer overstepping. This was deliberate, planned, executed with confidence that I would not challenge it. I confronted Elaine that evening. I asked her why a lawyer I had never met was writing to her about my estate. She sighed heavily, as though burdened by my lack of understanding, and said they were only trying to protect me from myself. She used the word protect twice. When I asked to see the documents, she said they were at Mark's office and that it was too complicated to go through them right now. I watched her carefully then, the way she avoided my eyes, the way her hands moved restlessly. For the first time I saw not my daughter but someone afraid of being exposed. That night sleep would not come. I lay awake replaying conversations from the past year, seeing them now with new eyes. The offers to help that came with conditions. The sudden interest in my doctors, my finances, my schedule. I felt grief, yes, but also a rising determination. I had survived widowhood, financial uncertainty, and decades of hard work. I would not be quietly written out of my own life. The breaking point arrived a few days later, when I discovered my power of attorney had been changed. A notice came in the mail, unsigned by me, stating that Mark now held decision-making authority over my affairs. I sat at the kitchen table holding that paper, the same table where I had once helped my children with homework and taught them right from wrong. My hands did not shake this time. I felt something settle into place. Anger, when it finally arrived, was calm and precise. I understood then that confronting them emotionally would achieve nothing. They had already decided who I was in their story. What they had not accounted for was the woman who had kept copies, who had paid attention, who knew that truth leaves a trail. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I simply stopped sharing information and started gathering it. I began documenting everything. Dates, conversations, copies of letters. I returned to the bank, this time requesting formal records. I scheduled my own medical appointment and asked for notes to be corrected. I contacted my old attorney's office, not yet revealing everything, only asking whether he might still be available. Each small action restored a piece of myself that had been quietly taken. In the evenings I sat with my notebook, writing down what I knew and what I still needed to learn. The house felt different then. No longer a place of passive comfort, but of quiet resolve. I realized that the most dangerous assumption my children had made was that I would choose peace over truth. They mistook my silence for surrender. By the end of that month, I was no longer confused or afraid. I was prepared. And while they continued to believe their plan was unfolding smoothly, I was already several steps ahead, waiting for the right moment to step into the light and let the facts speak for me. There was a quiet ritual to my mornings then, one I had never needed before. I woke early, before the sun softened the edges of the house, brewed a single cup of coffee, and sat at the dining table with my notebook and documents spread neatly before me. I had stopped letting Elaine manage my errands, stopped answering Mark's calls unless I felt steady enough to listen without reacting. This was not avoidance. It was strategy. I needed clarity more than comfort. The first real step forward came when I met with Mr. Caldwell, the attorney who had helped draft my original will years earlier. His office smelled of old paper and lemon polish, a scent that immediately grounded me. When he looked up from the documents I laid out, his expression shifted from polite interest to concern. He didn't interrupt as I explained slowly and carefully what I had discovered. When I finished, he removed his glasses and folded his hands. "These signatures aren't yours," he said simply. The words loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized was clenched. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't confused. The proof existed outside of my own mind, solid and undeniable. He explained what would need to happen next, the process of requesting certified copies, comparing handwriting, tracing how authority had been transferred without my consent. I listened closely, asking questions, writing notes. This was familiar territory. This was paper. This was truth. Over the next few weeks, my life became measured in small, deliberate actions. I requested copies of every amendment filed in my name. I signed forms authorizing access to bank surveillance footage. I contacted the notary whose stamp appeared on documents I had never seen. Each phone call felt like walking into cold water. Uncomfortable at first, then bracing. What surprised me most was how often people hesitated, then admitted something hadn't felt right at the time. A signature rushed. A meeting held without me present. A phone call made on my behalf that I had never approved. One afternoon, the notary agreed to meet. She was young, nervous, and clearly uncomfortable as she explained that Elaine had insisted I was ill and unable to come in person. She had been told I would sign later, that it was urgent. As she spoke, her voice wavered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I simply listened, letting her fill the silence. By the end, she was apologizing through tears and offering a written statement. I accepted it calmly. I understood fear. I also understood responsibility. During this time, my youngest son, David, began calling more frequently. At first, he sounded cautious, as though unsure which version of me he would reach. I didn't tell him everything. I asked questions instead. What had he been told? What did he believe? Slowly, I realized how carefully information had been filtered to him. He had been assured I was declining, that decisions were being made for my own good. Hearing it confirmed what I already knew. The story had been rehearsed and distributed. There were moments late at night when grief surfaced unexpectedly. I would catch myself remembering my children as they once were. Small hands reaching for mine, voices calling for help with homework. The pride I felt watching them grow. Those memories hurt now, not because they were false, but because they had been used as cover for something ugly. I let myself feel that sadness without letting it weaken my resolve. Mourning did not mean retreating. As the evidence accumulated, Mr. Caldwell asked me an important question. Did I want to handle this quietly through private legal channels, or was I prepared for it to become public? I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the birthday party laughter, the whispered concern, the way my competence had been quietly questioned in rooms I wasn't in. I thought about other women my age, how easily we are dismissed. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me with its steadiness. I want it on the record, I said. I want the truth heard. The court date was set. Papers were filed. Notices sent. I said nothing to Mark or Elaine. I continued my routines, attended church, waved to neighbors, accepted help only when I asked for it. I could feel the tension building beneath the surface, though they still believed they were in control. That illusion began to crack when David called one evening, his voice low and urgent. He told me Mark was angry, that Elaine was nervous, that they sensed something shifting but didn't know what. I hung up the phone and sat quietly, the house wrapped in evening light. On the table beside me lay the folder Mr. Caldwell had prepared, thick now with documents, statements, and photographs. I ran my hand over it once, feeling the weight. This was no longer about reclaiming money or authority. It was about reclaiming my name. When I turned out the lights that night, I knew the next time we would all be together, it would not be around a family table. It would be in a courtroom under oath with witnesses listening. And for the first time since this began, I slept deeply, knowing the truth was ready to speak. The morning of the hearing arrived without drama. No thunder, no trembling hands, no last-minute panic. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy suit and the pearl earrings my husband had given me years ago. They were not flashy, but they carried weight. As I fastened them, I looked at my reflection and felt something unfamiliar but welcome: certainty. Whatever happened next, I would not be spoken for again. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a scent that reminded me of banks and libraries, places where records are kept and truth is expected to endure. Mr. Caldwell greeted me quietly, his presence steady. Across the room, I saw my children arrive together. Mark walked slightly ahead, his jaw set, his confidence already strained. Elaine stayed close to him, clutching her purse with both hands. David entered last, hesitating when he saw me, his expression unreadable. No one approached. No one spoke. The silence felt earned. When we were called in, the room settled into a hush that pressed gently against my ears. I took my seat, folded my hands, and waited. The judge reviewed the case with methodical care, her tone neutral, professional. Then she asked the question that had once echoed in my mind like a fracture: whether I had authorized the changes to my will. This time I answered clearly, "No, Your Honor." My voice did not waver. From there the unraveling began. Mr. Caldwell presented the original documents first, their dates and signatures clean and consistent. Then came the amendments. The discrepancies were small to an untrained eye but glaring to anyone who looked closely. Handwriting that leaned when mine stood upright. Dates that overlapped with times I was documented to be elsewhere. The courtroom grew quiet as each inconsistency was explained. The bank footage followed. Grainy images appeared on a screen. Elaine at the counter, Mark beside her, papers spread out between them. I watched without expression, though inside something hardened into resolve. The teller testified next, her voice nervous but honest. She described being told I was ill, unavailable, that urgency justified bending protocol. The notary's statement was read aloud. Her written apology entered into record. With each piece, the story my children had constructed began to collapse under its own weight. When Mark was called to speak, he stood stiffly, adjusting his tie too many times. He said they were acting in my best interest, that they feared for my safety, that I had become forgetful. The judge listened patiently, then asked a single question. "Did you obtain medical documentation declaring your mother incompetent?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause stretched. The answer, when it came, was quiet. "No." Elaine was next. Her voice shook as she spoke of stress, of responsibility, of love. She cried when questioned about signing my name, insisting she believed she had permission. The judge asked where that permission was documented. Elaine's tears slowed. She looked at Mark, then at the floor. There was nothing to produce. David watched from the gallery, his face pale. When our eyes met briefly, I saw understanding dawn, followed by shame. He had not orchestrated this, but he had accepted it without question. That realization, I knew, would follow him long after the hearing ended. The judge recessed briefly. Those minutes felt longer than the entire morning. I sat still, listening to the muted sounds of shifting feet and whispered conversations. When she returned, the room rose and fell with her movement. Her ruling was clear, measured, and firm. All fraudulent amendments were declared void. Authority improperly transferred was revoked. The original will and trust were reinstated in full. The gavel struck once. The sound was sharp, final. Mark stared ahead, stunned. Elaine covered her mouth, her shoulders sagging. David lowered his head. I felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. What I felt was restoration, quiet and complete. My name, my voice, my intentions had been returned to me in a room full of witnesses. As we stood to leave, people avoided my children's eyes. A few glanced at me with something like respect. Outside, the Texas sun was bright, unremarkable, steady. I paused on the courthouse steps, breathing in the warm air, aware that this moment would divide my life into before and after. The truth had been spoken aloud. There was no undoing that now. The weeks after the ruling passed more slowly than I expected. Not because there was chaos, but because there was a strange quiet that followed the exposure of everything hidden. Legal consequences unfolded methodically. Accounts that had been accessed without my consent were frozen and reviewed. Powers of attorney were formally revoked. Letters arrived from institutions that now addressed me directly again. Their language careful, respectful, unmistakably mine. Each envelope felt like a small restoration, a confirmation that my identity had been returned to its rightful owner. Mark did not call. Elaine sent a message once, long and emotional, filled with apologies that focused more on her fear than on my experience. I read it once, then placed it in my notebook without responding. I was not ready to comfort people who had tried to erase me. I needed time to understand who I was now, after learning what my own children were capable of. Forgiveness, I knew, could not be rushed, and reconciliation could not exist without accountability. David came to see me in person a few weeks later. He stood in the doorway of my house, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than I remembered. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had once helped him practice spelling words and sign permission slips. He spoke first, his voice low, unsteady. He told me he should have asked questions, that he had trusted his siblings because it was easier than confronting the possibility they were wrong. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him the truth plainly. Silence can be a choice, and choices have consequences. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and said he wanted to do better. I told him we would see. Trust, once broken, does not rebuild itself on promises alone. Outside my family, the shift was noticeable. Friends who had grown distant began calling again. Neighbors stopped me to say how strong I had been, how inspiring it was to see someone stand up for herself. I accepted their words politely, though I did not feel heroic. I felt grounded. There is a difference. Strength, I had learned, is not loud. It is consistent. It shows up with documents, with patience, with the willingness to sit through discomfort until the truth can no longer be ignored. In the quiet mornings, I returned to my routines. Coffee at the table. Mail opened slowly, deliberately. I updated my estate documents one final time, this time adding safeguards that required my presence and independent verification for any future changes. It wasn't about distrust alone, it was about clarity. I also made a point to speak openly with my attorney about what had happened, ensuring there would be a clear record for anyone who ever questioned my competence again. My voice, now documented, would not be easily dismissed. Emotionally, the process was less tidy. There were days when grief rose unexpectedly, when I mourned not just the betrayal but the illusion of the family I thought I had. I allowed myself those moments. I had earned them, but I did not let them define me. I reminded myself that being a mother does not require surrendering dignity, and being older does not mean surrendering authority. Age, I realized, can sharpen judgment as much as it softens the body. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, I found a picture of myself in my 30s, standing in front of our first house, smiling despite exhaustion. I barely recognized her at first, then felt a wave of recognition so strong it startled me. She had been underestimated too. She had kept going anyway. I placed the photo back in its envelope, understanding that this story was not about revenge in the way people often imagine it. It was about continuity, about honoring the woman I had always been. If there is one thing I want understood, it is this: justice does not require bitterness. It requires presence. It requires paying attention, trusting your instincts, and believing that your voice matters even when others insist it does not. I did not win because I shouted. I won because I stayed, because I documented, because I refused to disappear quietly. Now, when I sit in my home, the air feels different. Not lighter exactly, but honest. I move forward without illusions, but also without shame. My life is still mine. And that knowledge, earned the hard way, is a piece no one can take from me again.